Tantra Illuminated with Dr. Christopher Wallace is a journey through the depths of the human experience, as viewed through the lens of the tradition called non-dual Shaiva Tantra. This multi-format podcast delves into the fascinating world of classical Tantra and its intersections with philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, human development, and the broader world of spirituality. Today's episode is a conversation, and I'm being interviewed along with my colleague and friend, Dr. Ben Joffe. This particular episode of the podcast is unusual, even unique, because it was originally recorded as part of a project for my friend Katherine Bennett's master's program in yogic studies at Naropa University. So we recorded this conversation, not knowing if it would ever see the light of day, but I decided to release it with Katherine's permission because it's full of interesting material and it's, I think, quite an enjoyable conversation. And much of the interest comes from Dr. Ben Joffe, who's a young and fairly brilliant scholar of Tibetan Buddhism who focuses on areas of that tradition not well understood yet. For example, he studies and practices with the householder teachers of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, whereas the vast majority of that tradition has been mediated to us by monks, such as the Dalai Lama and various other lamas and tulkus and rinpoches. I'll read a little bit about Ben from his bio so that you have a better sense of where he's coming from. His research interests focus specifically on the anthropology of Tibet and the Tibetan diaspora. His doctoral dissertation research was concerned with the ways in which the esoteric knowledge and charisma of Tibetan non-celibate tantric ritual specialists, known as Ngpa, are being mediated, circulated, appropriated, and contested in light of the increasing globalization of Tibetan Buddhism. He is interested in how Ngpa, these non-celibate Tibetan tantric ritual specialists, engage institutional and other forms of authority in exile, and ways in which the expertise, charisma, and activities of such specialists can be said to contribute to the forging of particular moral orders and imaginaries in situations of dislocation, change, and uncertainty. So if you're not familiar with Ben's work, he's given many interviews on the Guru Viking podcast, which is quite a good podcast. And he's also the editor of a book called Karma Mudra by his teacher, Dr. Naida. And that book presents to us the context in which sexual practices happen in the Tantric Buddhism of Tibet as taught by householders. So that's quite interesting to some people, at least. And I'm very happy to be connected to Ben. And I'm also very happy that Katherine gave us permission to publish this conversation. So she interviews us at the time she was doing her MA in yogic studies at Naropa, and she went on to do another MA in transpersonal wilderness therapy, also at Naropa University. And she's now become a non-dual therapist and focuses on transpersonal psychology, Buddhist psychology, wilderness therapy, mindfulness-based stress reduction, internal family systems, cognitive behavioral therapy, and psychedelic-assisted therapy. So she's one of a new wave of these multimodal therapists who are much needed in today's world. If you're interested in her work, check out the link in the show notes. Okay, sorry for the long introduction, but it was necessary in this case. I hope you enjoy the conversation, Tantrik Sādhanā in the Modern World, with myself and Dr. Ben Joffe, hosted by Katherine Bennett.
I'm here with Christopher Wallace and Ben Joffe, and we will be discussing undertaking a Tantrik Sādhanā in the modern world.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Nice to be here.
Welcome, Chris. Can you tell me a little bit about your journey to become a scholar practitioner?
Sure. It's a bit of a long story, but the short version would be that at a fairly young age of 16, I met an Indian guru, a meditation master, and I received initiation from her. And so I lived in the ashram for over 2 years, as well as several summers. And it was there that I decided to take an academic path. And I didn't know exactly where it was going to lead, but I met several professors at my guru's ashram that were scholar practitioners, meaning they were well-respected university professors who also practiced what they studied. And these professors inspired me to take this academic track because I wanted to just know more about these traditions that I was practicing. I wanted to really dig deep into the philosophy and where it came from also. And so I attended University of Rochester. Then I was able to have my pick of graduate schools, and I ended up going to actually 3 different postgraduate programs and earning multiple different degrees, just because I wanted to study with different great teachers and I wanted to go deep in the study. But another thing happened, so I continued to be a practitioner that whole time, but at first I kept these identities quite separate in a way, the practitioner identity and the academic or budding scholar identity, and we're actually encouraged to do that, not explicitly but implicitly in countless different ways. In postgraduate programs, we're encouraged to sort of keep our practitioner identity in the closet, and so the thing that actually encouraged me to start to weave together these 2 identities was teaching in yoga studios. So this is something that if you're studying, yoga philosophy and Indian philosophy, you can pick up a little extra money on the side by giving talks at yoga studios. And that's all it was at first. But I came to enjoy that more and more. And as I was teaching these practitioners in various yoga teacher trainings and immersions and things, they would ask the sort of questions that practitioners ask about, applying these teachings and these spiritual philosophies to real life. Those are different sorts of questions from the questions that academics ask. So as I continued to teach in yoga studios more and more, it organically encouraged me to weave together my academic and practitioner identities and to become an actual scholar practitioner, which I discovered, that's something different from being a scholar and a practitioner because you have to stop separating them, allow them to come together. And that's actually a delicate thing because a lot of scholar practitioners, if they're dogmatic about their religious or spiritual commitments, that skews their scholarship. That can be a problematic element. So the only way to be a legitimate scholar practitioner, I discovered, is to value truth above all. Meaning to say, sometimes the historical record doesn't confirm or corroborate what we would like to believe to be true about the traditions we're practicing, and sometimes it does. And to come to understand that one's spirituality can be valid without needing to tie it to specific kind of historical assertions. That was an important process for me, and I did come to value truth above all as the kind of foundation that allowed me to weave together these practitioner-scholar identities. And finally, what ended up happening is that it actually changed my whole career path, because, you know, as a graduate student in a subject like this, you know, any subject like Indian philosophy or you know, sociology, anthropology, like that's an academic career track, meaning you assume you're going to be a professor because that's the only paying job you could get with this knowledge. But then that turned out to not be true, because the growth of the yoga industry was such that this opportunity opened up little by little of, oh, I could actually make a decent living, make the same salary, as it were, as a college professor by teaching freelance in these yoga studios and teacher trainings around the country and around the world. And that is what ended up happening, is that I realized, well, I actually enjoy this more than teaching undergraduates in the university setting. And so, you know, I'm gonna take that plunge and just see what happens. And that work has grown over quite a few years now. And yeah, so that's just, again, the sort of short version of the story. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Welcome, Ben.
Hi.
Can I ask about your journey to become a scholar practitioner?
Sure. I think listening to Chris, there are several overlaps. I also kind of began as a practitioner. I wasn't raised in any particular kind of spiritual or religious home. I had sort of mild-mannered atheist, agnostic parents, but who thankfully were very encouraging of my own impulses and interests and questions. And growing up in South Africa, for whatever reason, from a young age, I had spiritual inclinations. I had, for the want of a better word, kind of personal paranormal experiences, and seeking to understand that. From a young age, my parents encouraged me to just do my own research, go to the library, meet people who are involved in, I guess you could say, general sort of new agey business, spiritual traditions of various kinds. And a real turning point for me was when I was about 10 or 11. My maternal grandmother, who was kind of I think she fancied herself a witch, but she never quite got that far. She was very interested in divination, and she saw my interest, and her and my mother conspired together and bought me a set of tarot cards, which I took to very quickly and naturally, and almost immediately I began reading tarot and using other forms of divination for clients. So I was, from the age of 11, interacting with a lot of adults, both as clients and then also as peers who were interested in alternative healing and spirituality. And I suspect, looking back now, that exposure in such a multicultural place as South Africa, very plural religious environment too, that exposure to all kinds of different spiritual claims and interests and traditions made me want to kind of get a purchase on these things. I was meeting so many people who were really genuine about their spiritual experiences and interests, but they all had alternative frameworks and claims. And so I think I fell naturally into, once I entered college, into cultural anthropology. I realized that was a really good fit for me to explore my own spiritual experiences and interests from a sort of more critical historical perspective, get an outside perspective on those things. And so then I entered into a kind of period of academic training and seeking of academic legitimacy. So I sort of learned how to talk to skeptical non-practitioner scholars about my interests and my experiences, in a way kind of trying to justify them to myself. And initially, when I was in sort of my fourth year in South Africa, I toyed with the idea of doing research with neo-pagans and Western occultists, ritual magicians, because that was really sort of my background of practices and experimentation as a young person, mostly reading books and meeting up with like-minded folks. And I tried that out, and it felt strange and uncomfortable. I had some sort of interesting experiences with mentors and professors who were a little bit uncomfortable about my status as both a practitioner and a long-term practitioner and a scholar. So then I wasn't sure if I wanted to continue with academia, even though it sort of fit my personality. And I changed track a bit when I started a PhD program in the US, and I thought I had ended up meeting Tibetan sort of de facto diplomats from the Tibetan exile administration who were in South Africa at the behest of the Central Tibetan administration, the government in exile, to represent the Tibetan political cause. And in meeting them, my long-standing interest in Buddhism blossomed, and I became interested in Tibetan culture. And I knew I wanted to understand ordinary Tibetans' lives and experiences of their own religious traditions sort of firsthand on the ground before I got involved in anything myself. So yeah, after now 13, 14 years of teaching and studying anthropology, in the course of doing my doctoral dissertation research, I think slowly but surely, kind of in a circumspect way, I've become more comfortable with identifying as a practitioner as well. In the course of meeting my own current Tibetan Buddhist teacher, I've come to be more comfortable with identifying myself as a practitioner of Buddhism, even though I don't consider myself a very good one or a very experienced one. So for me, it's been kind of a trajectory of Western occultism and deep involvement from a young age, but very much sort of in an eclectic, idiosyncratic, individual way, which led me to anthropology and scholarship of various kinds, which then led me to Tibetan studies, not necessarily as a practitioner, more as an anthropologist, and then as my own research developed, more as a practitioner of Tibetan tantric Buddhism. So it's kind of been an interesting back and forth over time. Yeah.
And can I just add one thing that listeners might want to know, which is that both Ben and myself are proficient in the respective languages of the traditions that we study, because I think this is a really important point. Without proficiency or fluency in the language, in Ben's case Tibetan, and in my case Sanskrit, without that proficiency, you can't access primary sources in terms of textual sources, nor can you, in Ben's case, access primary sources in terms of oral transmission that takes place in Tibetan. So just that's an important kind of feature of credibility for anyone who represents these traditions in either an academic or a non-academic way.
Right, absolutely. I mean, it's an expectation of anthropologists at a doctoral level to have that sort of proficiency. And then also for myself, I knew that before I made any choices about practicing Tibetan Buddhism, I wanted to sort of have a self-imposed probation period where I would learn Tibetan so that I could engage with primary sources and texts firsthand, so that I could know what ordinary Tibetans' lives were like. I could spend time interacting with them in their own terms, meeting converts to the tradition. I wanted to first do all that before even considering the possibility of practicing in a sort of dedicated way and identifying as a practitioner. So that was both something that fit with my academic training, but was also a personal choice.
Wow, thank you. As a master's student at Naropa University, I'm studying religious studies focusing on Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, but my interests have kind of shifted from Buddhism to Tantric Buddhism and Tantric Shaivism or Shaktism. And so it's really interesting to hear both of your stories, from practitioners to scholar practitioners, and your academic and personal practice journeys. That definitely relates to my life and my trajectory, and so it's wonderful that we can talk about it in conversation, because I get the question all the time, like, what are you going to do with a master's in religious studies from Naropa University? And honestly, for me, it's just my own personal research. I'm studying Sanskrit so that I can go on and look at primary sources. But eventually I'll have to get a PhD because I need the 14, 15 years that you both have individually before I could really understand what it is that I'm looking for, this foundational truth that I'm kind of seeking. And so the academic journey is part of it, but the journey of a practitioner is also very important. So I do have some questions about, that is kind of the subject of our talk today. What is it like for a modern person who's a Westerner, non-Indian, non-Tibetan, to pursue these traditions with a really genuine interest and curiosity, wanting to have this be a part of our lives, a part of our kind of spiritual journey and academic journey for quite a lot of people? So one of the questions that I have for you is the importance of initiation in these traditions, whether it's Shaiva Tantra or Buddhist Tantra. It seems very important to have initiation in a lot of these traditional settings of these religions. So what does initiation actually mean, and what counts as initiation?
This is a very important question, and what I want to do is just contrast the role of initiation in the original tradition and how it makes sense to conceptualize it now and why that's different. So it's certainly the case that in the original tantric traditions, and still very much so in Buddhism, as Ben will address, but that initiation was a prerequisite for any access even to tantric teachings and practices. By definition, tantra is an initiatory spiritual world, and so that was the gateway, that the person, just speaking, in terms of Shaivism here, the person had to sort of prove themselves worthy, in a sense, of initiation, and worthiness here measured by the fact of their devotion and longing and authentic desire to practice, because Tantra positioned itself not so much as a religion, at least in India, but as a spiritual practice only available to those who had genuine spiritual longing, and weren't just going through the motions as many people do with religion. So the person who kind of demonstrated this longing, this devotion, this ardent desire, could then be initiated. Often they would be sort of tested a little bit, examined, and then initiated. And so to be clear, I use this word worthy, but that had nothing to do with caste, economic status, gender, or any of these other social factors. I mean, Tantra specifically positioned itself as the tradition that would initiate anyone from any caste, or even an outcast untouchable, if they showed the same devotion and ardent desire as those who already had been initiated. So there was a very tight container in those days, meaning to say you didn't get access to tantric scriptures or tantric practices or a tantric community or a tantric guru without initiation. It was the gateway for access to all of that. So that was about, to some extent, controlling knowledge in a beneficial way, right? That the teachings are encountered as being deeply sacred, and you feel incredibly privileged to receive these teachings if they are not available to the general public, if they're not watered down, if they're in this very tight container, one might call it. And so the role of initiation was a highly functional thing for the tradition at that time. And what's different now is that many tantric teachings and practices are out there in one way or another, often in distorted forms, but sometimes even in non-distorted forms. They're out there on the internet. They're out there by word of mouth. It happens all the time that people who've received even a formal tantric initiation, might share practices then with somebody who hasn't been initiated. That the kind of barriers for the transmission are now that were there before are now highly porous or non-existent. This is not to say, by the way, that all the tantric teachings and practices are there on the internet, because it's still the case that many of the more kind of advanced practices have been held as secret or as sacrosanct by practitioners. And I can, easily think of dozens of practices that are still not on the internet except on password protected sites. They're not on the public internet, right? So nonetheless, though, a lot of teachings and practices are out there, and so putting this gateway of initiation doesn't make sense in the way that it used to, because people already have access to what initiation would grant them access to, but not entirely. So in conclusion, the classification I want to mention is that sometimes tantric teachings are organized into three categories: outer teachings, inner teachings, and secret teachings. And it used to be, right, that outer teachings are only for those who are not yet initiated, little taste to see if do I want to apply for initiation. And then all the inner teachings would be gated by initiation, and the secret teachings would often be gated by yet another level of initiation. And now it seems to me that the teachings and practices I'm calling secret here are the ones that are still not available on the internet for the most part in most lineages. But the teachings previously called inner are often widely available. So it seems to me that if we're gonna, at least in respect to Shaiva Tantra or Shakta Shaiva Tantra, if we're gonna continue to utilize initiation, it's just about moving the gate back, if you see what I mean. It's now a gate for access to the secret teachings, but not to the inner teachings, because why bother to try to restrict something that's already out there? And just one example I'll give before I hand it off to Ben here is that there's a tantra called the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, which is an important text in the Shaiva Tantra tradition, that previously was secret in the sense of available only to initiates, right? But now it's that particular cat is out of the bag, and it's out there in multiple translations, almost all of which are substantially flawed and problematic translations. So I made the decision, as some other teachers have as well, I'm going to teach this text even though it's supposed to be only for initiates. I'm going to publicly teach this text because there are translations already out there and they're problematic. So we need to set the record straight. But I made the decision, I'm not going to teach any other tantra except tantras that are already in the public sphere. And any tantras that are not available to the general public, I'm not going to teach those publicly, but only to long-term students in a retreat setting. So that's a way of honoring the tradition, but acknowledging the situation in which we now find ourselves. And so I tell people, hey, you don't necessarily need, at least in our domain of Shakta Shaiva Tantra, you don't need a formal initiation. What you need is a commitment to study and practice, which initiation often was that commitment, among other things. And that people who kind of fetishize initiation are they're doing themselves a disservice, right? That we don't. A lot of people want to be initiated because they want to feel special. I'm one of the special few. And that's clearly spiritual ego. And since the practice is about, going beyond ego in many ways, that is not a good idea then. So I argue that getting initiated can actually be counterproductive for some people, because then they have that I'm one of the special few story, and that we should look at, if we're promoting initiation, why is it really necessary? And again, this is different in Shaivism from Buddhism, because Shaivism became deinstitutionalized after the Muslim conquest, whereas Buddhism, at least in Tibet, was still institutionalized. So there it's different, and I'll let Ben talk about that.
Yeah, thanks.
I was just thinking about something you said now, but it's always interesting to me how a lot of people act as if initiation means something than what it etymologically does, which is to initiate something, to open you up to the beginning of a profound practice, which you are going to then undertake over the course of this life or multiple lifetimes, right? But so often the kind of commodification of the idea of having achieved initiation, it sort of positions it. I've noticed this in different esoteric contexts. Sort of positions it as like the end goal. Like, now I've got initiation. This makes me special, as you said. But this is the opening up, right? This is the beginning of deepening of practice. So I think we sort of forget what's right in front of our faces. Initiation, it's literally the beginning. So yeah, as Chris mentioned, initiation always is often called in the Tibetan Tantric Buddhist context empowerment, which is perhaps a more direct translation of the Tibetan word wang or wangkur, the conferral of empowerment. It's a little different in the sense that, as Chris pointed to, empowerment ceremonies have become mainstreamed, popularized, and institutionalized, and connected with the kind of religious, social, even economic power of large-scale religious political institutions in Tibet. So I think one first thing to point out very simply is that in order to be practicing tantric Buddhist practices, one is required to have a teacher to transmit them, a qualified teacher, and then a qualified student, which entails various things. And then transmission, initiation is part of this, but transmission, broadly speaking, is usually understood as having three main components. So empowerment or initiation proper, the ceremony of initiation, the kind of opening up and the revealing of the deepening of practice. And then an oral transmission, the reading of a practice text or scripture that one receives as a kind of oral transmission from a qualified teacher. And then what Tibetans call chit, like direct oral instruction on the specific practices from a living teacher. So one is typically understood as having really received transmission, being authorized to practice, if one has received, if one has attended an empowerment or initiation ceremony and then has received oral transmission and also instruction from a guru. And so you can tell right away that also implies a sort of community of practice, right? Inevitably. And sort of expectations and obligations. So it's interesting that kind of maybe a little bit different to the Shaiva context that Chris is dealing with. It's not necessarily difficult to attend an initiation ceremony, a Vajrayana initiation today. We live in a world where His Holiness the Dalai Lama will give an extremely esoteric advanced tantric transmission over a series of weeks for, say, the Kala Chakra Tantra cycle, a very important tantric Buddhist textual cycle, to 80,000 people. And then that initiation ceremony will also be webcast on the internet. And the majority of Tibetans, and also in many cases non-Tibetans who are going to attend that initiation ceremony, are not there with the expectation that they will subsequently begin daily dedicated tantric yogic sadhana practice. So this is something that's important to understand, about just the nature of how empowerment ceremonies work in the Tibetan cultural and sort of global Vajrayana context. Often all that's required is just to show up. In the past, one had to seek out a guru and court them and request and give offerings of gold and so on. And now these things are quite readily available. And frequently a lot of people receive initiation, which is intended to lay out to point out the kind of nature of one's own being and of reality, and to lay out all of the dimensions of practice. Really, everything is kind of encapsulated in a wang. But many people who go, maybe they don't understand what's being said in Tibetan. They don't have the wang text in front of them, or maybe they're going because it's a social event, or as many Tibetans will say, because they receive some kind of powerful blessing by being present. But there's no sense in which they're engaging at various levels. So
Wang means empowerment, right?
it means empowerment,
Yeah.
and one is sort of exposed to the tantric meditational deity. One is shown the nature of that deity. It's modeled for the potential practitioner. And so in this way, I would say, like, being present for a wang ceremony, going to one, is surprisingly easy these days. And like I said, they're often kind of large-scale social public events. People's dogs are there, people's sleeping babies are there. So then it sort of forces us to think about, what does it mean to be qualified to begin to practice sort of with seriousness and understanding when one has that kind of status. So yeah, there is a lot of conversation now in the sort of global Vajrayana world about is it necessary for would-be students to kind of have some sort of prior instruction or preparation for understanding what this is and isn't, or what it could be, perhaps. These are ongoing kind of like hot issues right now. They're complex issues.
And just to clarify the contrast, because it is a stark contrast, because of the deinstitutionalization of Shaivism and of Tantra in India, if one does find a guru from whom one could receive proper tantric initiation, that's likely going to be a ceremony with a very small number of people, where you're being directly initiated by that guru or acharya. And so it's really the largest possible contrast from these modern wang empowerment ceremonies. So that's an interesting distinction. But again, the other difference being that you don't actually need formal initiation to access tantric practices that come from this Shaiva or Shakta Shaiva sphere.
Yeah, and that brings up a lot of interesting thoughts for me, because, people might read books like Karma Mudra, The Yoga of Bliss, or Tantra Illuminated, and really develop a curiosity and an interest for these traditions, whether it be Shakta Shaiva Tantra or Vajrayana, and they may want to undertake a practice that may feel very powerful for them, and they may feel a really strong connection to these traditions, even if they're not Indians or they're not Tibetans. And so kind of navigating how to enter into that sphere in the modern world because of these differences, to be able to pursue the teachings and the practices of a tradition which someone feels very resonant with, but may be unable to access a teacher, or be able to attend an empowerment if you go to Dharamsala, for example, and with 88,000 other people attend one of these wangs with the Dalai Lama. But then, what happens after, and how to work with these practices in a more serious or a more dedicated way to really kind of work your way slowly to the desired results, or, what is the goal with undertaking these practices, or the sadhana. So another factor that would be taken into consideration, which both of you mentioned, is the role of the guru, like not just initiation, but working with a living teacher, or whether that guru is someone who wrote a book 1,000 years ago, like Shemaraja in the Recognition Sutras. And so what do you think about the role of the guru, and does one need a guru?
So again, we need to contrast the pre-modern tradition with the diversity of views that we have now. And in the pre-modern tradition, it's simple and straightforward. Of course, you need a guru. In fact, you may need multiple gurus, but you at least need a root guru, a primary guru. Now, the root guru can be defined in different ways. It could be the one who gives you initiation. And it could also be the one who gives you the empowering transmission, that you are able to experience your essence nature due to the transmission of that teacher. So it could be the case that somebody traditionally might meet their root guru only once and receive this transmission, have the direct experience of their own essence nature, and then they're going to spend the rest of their spiritual lives sort of unpacking the significance of that and going deeper into it and realizing the nature of reality in light of that, meaning experiencing things from the perspective of essence nature, which is a whole process, with the aid of other teachers or gurus. So sometimes the terminology will be mula guru, root guru, and then upa gurus, but very powerful and helpful teachers that are actually just helping you, again, sort of unpack or fully explore the significance of that first glimpse, or you could also put it as traversing the path that first glimpse pointed out. And these are just metaphors, but so there's no possibility traditionally of a legitimate tantric sadhana or spiritual practice without a guru. Now, in the modern world, this people have become highly suspicious of gurus for very good reasons, because the most famous of them are inevitably involved in one form of scandal or another, often sexual scandals. But I think it's super important to point out that the public has a very skewed perception, because it's precisely the most famous gurus that are most likely to have a scandal. Because why are these gurus famous? Almost always they're famous because they want to be famous. And someone who wants to be famous is on an ego power trip, even if it's very well disguised, whereby the same kind of mind, the same kind of ego believes I'm above the law, the normal moral standards don't apply to me, and that person then engages in inappropriate and even sometimes illegal sexual activity. So it's important to contemplate that there are countless teachers and even gurus out there who don't have such scandals attached to them, and they're precisely the ones you're less likely to hear about or to read about in the news or on the internet. So that is a skewed view of the situation because of that. Having said that, I don't feel comfortable telling people this is how it has to be, because some people have the experience of transmission from a guru who's no longer in the body. Like, let's say they read the Recognition Sutras, which you mentioned, and they can sometimes some people can get a powerful transmission through the words of that master, and actually they could even feel the presence of that siddha or enlightened being. That being could come to them in a dream and give them a revelation, and this could of course be just their psyche engaged in wishful thinking, but it can also be real. The tradition itself says you can receive initiation in a dream, and it's a delicate thing because the person could be deluding themselves and want to be the special person who received that, or it could be real, and so I don't feel comfortable telling anyone you're doing it wrong. The only place which I would criticize, or the only view I would criticize, is this modern view of I am my own guru. Now, in the world of yoga, in the world of South Asian religions, in the world of Tantra, that is not a legitimate statement. Now, in other worlds, spiritual worlds, maybe it is. But it's not possible to be your own guru, specifically because you are conditioned. You're weighed down with all this socio-cultural conditioning, where you need guides and teachers on the path to help you see the difference between a moment of clear insight and the surfacing of a piece of deep conditioning, whether it's so-called positive or negative, whether it's sort of wishful thinking or whether it's what you hope to be true or what you are afraid might be true. Those thoughts can surface from deep in our subconscious. And so the teacher is there, or your teachers, because I personally do recommend having more than one teacher, help orient you to the difference between your deep conditioning and true insight, or your wishful thinking and true insight. So we are very good at deluding ourselves as humans. There's a whole field on this in neuroscience and cognitive science now, at how we delude ourselves in countless different ways. And so it's just from a traditional point of view, it's absurd to say I'm my own guru. It's just that you might as well be saying I am walking a version of the path guaranteed to not work. Which, so there's much more that could be said on this topic. But the last thing I want to say is just that it's not necessarily the case that you need the kind of guru who you can ask any question to and is always there for you to answer every question. It's almost impossible to find that person, at least as one person. So I think we're experimenting with different models. I'm advocating these days for the kula as guru, that is to say the community, a community that includes lots of well-informed, well-educated, well-practiced members. The whole community can serve as the guru, especially with the aid of online forums where that community can gather virtually. And there's other models, but that we need some form of guru, even if we're interpreting that term much more broadly than one traditionally might do. And
I don't have much to add to that other than just to say a lot of what you've laid out as kind of a traditional pattern for types of teachers and the importance of the teachers is very parallel with the Vajrayana context. It also just occurred to me, kind of randomly listening to you now, it seems like most people wouldn't find it too sort of controversial to say that you're probably not going to be your own therapist, right?
Good point.
But somehow, like, there's something almost impressive or sort of progressive about recognizing that you can be your own guru or something like that. So.
And I'm sure there are people who would say, I'm my own therapist, but most of us would rightly, I think, laugh at that and scoff at that.
Yeah, and of course I don't want to conflate therapy with the guru-disciple relationship, but I mean, I think that it's interesting to think about how it seems sensible in that one context and not so much in the other. It's... While you were talking, I was also thinking about this idea of single gurus too, because one of the most sort of striking features of some of the most egregious cases of abuse and sort of cult thinking that we've been seeing around the world around guru scandals and this sort of thing is usually a very insular environment where students have a sense that they're doing things right and in a traditional fashion by refusing to even imagine the possibility of another teacher, that their devotion should be measured in the extent to which they are committed only to one teacher or only to one group of fellow disciples or something like this. And for me, as a scholar and anthropologist observing Tibetan contemporary culture and looking at the historical record and informing myself in that way, this has always been one of the most strange parts of sort of contemporary Indo-Tibetan religious practice, especially amongst like Western converts. This idea that having one teacher at all costs is somehow a better model, a more traditional model. And for me, I've never quite understood that, because as Chris pointed out, in the Tibetan case, it's always been considered normal or perhaps even inevitable that one would have many teachers and many kinds of teachers and engage with a variety of communities. The root guru has a different status, of course, but again, as Chris said, like, it also doesn't require that one spend one's life savings to spend every moment with that teacher and sort of perform devotion in that way. I mean, of course, that for some people that can be really important and really beneficial for them and others. But you also hear stories, historical stories from Tibet as well, of ordinary people who meet their root guru in passing and perhaps never see them again, or meet them in a dream, and that was sufficient for them to sit with practices that were transmitted and make extraordinary accomplishments. So it's interesting, this sort of the popular models of like guru devotion and the kind of almost competitive situation we sometimes see with these cosmopolitan gurus around the world, and sort of inner circles of students, and who has the means to spend more time with them and have more access and perform their devotion in particular ways. When, I don't know, I mean, I'm no authority, but I always think one of the best ways you can perform your devotion to the teacher and the teachings and the community is by sensibly internalizing and applying the teachings and being a better person in the world.
Yeah.
And sometimes that doesn't require you to travel around with one teacher, or to aggressively defend a single institution or anything like that. It just requires you to practice.
Yeah.
And just a quick piggyback on what Ben said. I know we have to move on soon, but and I suppose this is a personal opinion, but I want to say, to me, it's so important. It was so important for me personally to have more than one teacher from more than one lineage, from multiple compatible lineages. That was super important. Why? Because I didn't actually really start to grok these teachings on this deeper non-conceptual level until I had heard them pointed to in multiple different ways, with different languaging, So, and I've found that there's many people out there like me who they hear one way of languaging the truth, because let's remember, ultimate truth can't be expressed in language, it can only be pointed to. And they hear the same way of languaging that pointing over and over again, and then if they encounter another teacher who's a powerfully awake being but is pointing with different language, that can be a flashpoint where it's like, oh my gosh, now I'm getting it, because I'm able to hone in on what this is by these different ways of languaging it. So I think it's super important that those of you out there who have practiced spiritual monogamy to not be, I'm not saying be promiscuous, because you have to work with teachers whose teachings are compatible, or you're actually getting destabilized in your spiritual life. But having more than one teacher, as long as they are compatible, and to know, you should ask your teachers, are you compatible with this other person, and vice versa. Then that can just be so powerful and instrumental to deeper realization, because your realization has got to go beyond belief in the words that your teacher is speaking. It's got to go to experience of where they're pointing to.
Yeah, so that kind of points to some of the problems that modern practitioners will face when whether focusing on one teacher only and becoming kind of dogmatic with the view of, well, my teacher said, so this is the only truth for me, and then maybe that leads to judgment of other teachings. So kind of opening up the view and taking in more teachings from multiple people is also a way that modern practitioners can kind of navigate the practice, because there are so many teachers out there are so many books out there. And so I guess the next logical question would be, authenticity is kind of one of these buzzwords that comes up, and what do modern practitioners who are not native to these traditions need to know in order to engage with them in an authentic way?
Well, what I can say about that, especially as an anthropologist who's been trained to sort of have to develop cultural literacy in a community with which I might be working or studying, we have a curious situation in the sort of historical trajectory of how Tibetan Tantric Buddhism has come to non-Tibetans. And one aspect of that is that it is rare to go to a Dharma center of Tibetan Buddhism in the West. It's it's not impossible, and of course there's a lot of diversity, but generally speaking, many Dharma centers in the West are not overflowing with native Tibetan Buddhists, ethnically Tibetan Buddhists or Himalayan Buddhists. And this is interesting and remarkable because it's not the case in some other Buddhist contexts, where a lot of native-born Asian American Buddhists are practicing on a regular basis in the same community or center with converts. And so this is, I don't want to get into the sort of historical reasons why this is the case, but I always find it a little bit unfortunate because you have a situation where many converts to Vajrayana are primarily interacting. Their prime model for practice, just ordinary practice, is an elite lama who they may only see periodically. And there can be a sort of cultural inferiority too, where people are really wanting to practice in an authentic way, but then they don't always have immediate sort of everyday and natural models for that practice. Especially if they're the only Tibetans they know might be their teacher and the teacher's immediate family or networks or friends. So this poses some challenge because non-Tibetan converts, in my opinion, shouldn't be trying to model their practice sort of slavishly on Tibetan standards. The goal is not to become a Tibetan in order to successfully practice Tibetan Buddhism. But I think there's enormous value for so many reasons in people who are interested in an indigenous religious tradition to do as much as they can, even if it's at a remove and just from reading and being attentive to having historical cultural literacy about these traditions. Understanding that they emerge from a particular time and place, and that they are also the indigenous spiritual traditions of a living group of people, and in this case, in the Tibetan case, a group of people who've experienced cultural genocide, colonization of their country, enormous dispossession, and so that has to factor into how interested outsiders want to engage with this tradition. And it's not just, to learn enough about Tibetan cultural life to ape it in some way because you believe that will make you a better Buddhist, but it's about achieving respect and understanding, and in my view, hopefully, more sort of complicated and healthy and beneficial interactions between native practitioners and non-native ones, because what we are seeing, what we've been seeing for decades, and what seems to be happening more and more, is that Western Dharma institutions, the institutionalized forms of practice are becoming almost unrecognizable to indigenous practitioners. It's not uncommon for Tibetan friends of mine to have their first exposure to second, third generation practitioners of a sort of Western Vajrayana and sort of be like, what is this? What's going on here? I recognize it, of course. I recognize. I know the genealogies and the histories that have led to this community existing as it does, but it doesn't feel like home to me, and it's not necessarily a welcoming space to me, or it's not. It just feels different to how we do it, and different isn't necessarily bad, but I think we need to have a sense of these branching trajectories and these divergences that are happening, and what the implications of those may actually be further into the future as well. So I'm biased in my professional training, but the more that would-be practitioners can familiarize themselves with Tibetan language, Tibetan history, living, breathing, ordinary Tibetans who may not even be especially religious, as they in the ways they consider, in the ways they evaluate religiosity, is really good medicine. I think that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, and it's quite different in the case of Shaiva Tantra and Shakta Shaiva Tantra, because, well, for 2 reasons. One, I mentioned this term deinstitutionalization that happened in the Indian sphere because, up until roughly 1100 or 1200, tantric traditions in India were much like they are in Tibet, or were in Tibet up until the invasion of the Chinese recently. That these traditions were government funded. In other words, they had royal patronage, and therefore they were institutionalized. Yet there were always grassroots versions of them also going on, but they were largely institutionalized. And then with the Muslim conquests, circa 1200, these traditions became deinstitutionalized, and as a result, if you look at just early modern and modern India, it has become incredibly syncretistic, meaning to say everything getting mixed together, a whole bunch of different traditions getting mixed together that were previously kept quite separate in a way. And this is not something that modern Indians even know, that what we now call Hinduism, that this kind of stew of all these devotional traditions and tantric ideas and practices and all this stuff mixed together in a single stew were originally sort of different dishes in the Indian religious cuisine, to use that metaphor, distinct traditions and distinct paths. And so because of this syncretism that we see in modern India, Western practitioners tend to think that they can be as syncretistic as they like. They can just mix everything up together, and you get a mixture of kind of New Age ideas. And a lot of people don't realize that the New Age is a religion. That it's a highly diverse religion, but it is a religion with its own sort of dogmas, even that the practitioners of it don't consider our dogmas, but like all paths lead to the same goal. That's an example of a sort of New Age dogma that these traditional knowledge systems and spiritual systems disagree with, actually.
Strenuously in many cases.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, they say that is absolutely not true. So there's a lot that could be said about this, but the main thing I wanted to highlight is that the hardest thing for what I'm just calling a Western practitioner to accept, any non-native or even a native practitioner who's more influenced by Western society than by their own native society, it's hard for them to accept that for your spiritual path to work from a traditional point of view, there has to be internal coherency. And the only way there can be internal coherency is by avoiding the mix and match or pick and mix individualistic syncretism that's so popular today. In other words, just like it's not legitimate to say I'm my own guru, it's also not legitimate, traditionally speaking, to kind of make your own spiritual path by picking, I like this from over here and this from this, and I'm going to put them all together and somehow it's going to work. And this is not just a traditional objection. This is I would say a practical objection, because everybody I know who I consider, you could call this a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, but I really do have given a lot of thought to this, that people who are really awake, I don't know anyone in that condition who got there through a syncretistic, self-assembled, what the French call bricolage, this kind of self-assembled spirituality. And a big reason for that is that these traditional systems were carefully curated over centuries to be internally coherent. It's not to say that this way of describing the nature of ultimate reality is inherently better to some other way, but rather that the system needs to be internally coherent, meaning there's alignment of the view teachings, the spiritual or philosophical teachings, with the practices, and both are aligned with the goal of the system or of the spiritual life. So alignment of what's called alignment of view, practice, and fruit, which means goal of the practice. And that alignment needs to be strong for the spiritual path to actually work. And that's precisely why, I think it's important to you can shop around as much as you want, but ultimately you're going to need to go deep with an internally coherent system and instead of your own personal syncretism in order to go beyond your own mind, your own ego, and your own conditioning.
Right.
So that's something that not everyone wants to hear, but they need to grapple with it if they actually want to traverse the path as more than just a hobby or a kind of cultural dilettantism.
Right, a kind of culinary adventure or aesthetic experiment. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I've seen that a lot with young modern practitioners, especially at Naropa University. I'm taking some meditation courses, and they're kind of teaching in yogic traditions and Buddhist traditions and tantric traditions, and kind of showing us this whole sample platter of what's out there for practice. And people might identify with one practice or one tradition more than others, but ultimately people kind of have a mixed experience in their life, and they're kind of putting a hodgepodge together. And even both of you with your stories of how you kind of became a scholar practitioner have you've done a lot with tarot, and and you experienced different traditions and kind of created your own life practice and your own maybe spiritual practice. But there is a difference for appreciating one tradition for what makes it distinct and what the goal of that path is, and going deep with a certain practice, like you said, versus mixing everything together and then conflating it as one thing, and that it's all saying the same thing. So another question that I would have would be, if somebody is reading these books and they feel drawn to these traditions and they want to practice and they're very sincere and they're very eager to learn, and maybe they have a teacher, they've received some kind of empowerment, what is presumed in these tantric traditions as a prerequisite for that practice?
Well, first off, I want to clarify something that I think needs to be super clear, is that when people are, and again, especially non-native practitioners, when they're reading books about this kind of dimension of spirituality and these traditions, they're often reading books like Tantra Illuminated, which serves as an overview of the whole Shaiva Tantric tradition, and they don't necessarily cue into the very key fact that in the lived reality of these traditions, they are highly lineage specific. That we have modern ideas of conversion based in Western monotheisms don't apply in the same way. Like, you can't in a sense convert to the tradition as a whole because it's internally diverse. And that coherency I was talking about actually looks a little bit different from this lineage to that lineage. Yes, there are overarching things by virtue of which we can say these are all tantric lineages, but when it gets really down into the nitty-gritty, which is what matters as a practitioner, there are significant and key differences. Like, here's how we're implementing the technology over here in this lineage, the spiritual technology, and here's how we're implementing it over here, and we're highlighting different things, and we're sort of targeting a different kind of practitioner. So it has to be super clear that that everything is in the tradition is going to be lineage specific, right? So that you're going to need to find a lineage which is is resonant with you, like, and this is a problematic term, right? Because people that resonates with me usually just means I like it and it suits my preconceptions and assumptions about for now of what spirituality should look like,
Right.
And way too often that resonates with me can mean I'm comfortable with that.
Yeah, not challenged.
But the spiritual path is not meant to make you comfortable. It needs to make you uncomfortable as part of the process, And yet it does also need to be resonant in the deeper sense of that term. I mean, there needs to be something at a very deep inside you, deeper than your mind, that responds to that presentation of the path in that particular lineage, And so if the lineage is sufficiently alive, then you're not going to be limited to just one teacher within the same lineage, So I give the example of my own lineage, or the lineage I tend to be based in, which is Trika. The Trika lineage of Shaiva Tantra is represented by quite a few teachers these days, quite a few legitimate and qualified English-speaking teachers, and so one could decide, this is the lineage that I resonate with, and yet that also challenges me, and still have a number of different teachers, and the same exact thing, as I'm sure Ben will say, applies to in Tibetan Buddhism. Generally, you're going to be, you're going to be in a specific subset of Tibetan Buddhism, like Nyingma, or Gelugpa or whatever, and even within that, you're going to have more than one. You're going to have an array of possible teachers, and you can be sure they're compatible because they're within the same lineage grouping. But ultimately, you're going to need to work with specific lineage, or you're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of spiritual practice sufficient for it to actually accomplish what it's supposed to accomplish.
Nobody practices Tibetan Buddhist tantric yoga generically.
Right.
No one practices it in general. Right. You're practicing a particular set of practices, of sadhanas that have been transmitted and have been performed by people in the past. You are part of a family. You're part of this is the vocabulary of tantric traditions. You are entering into a family, a history of practice, and that is deeply protective and empowering too, because you have a lineage of direct accomplishment and precedent that you can insert yourself into. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. It is interesting though, because as scholars, and especially anthropologists, researchers are interested in assessing these traditions in a kind of broader, more historical, comparative way, and say, what are the family resemblances across Indo-Tibetan traditions, or across Shaiva Tantra lineages in general? And there's value in that kind of work, but you can't apply that thinking to lived practice, because it's not operative. It doesn't work. I also wanted to quickly say, I could definitely get on a tangent about this, but a point that Chris mentioned earlier about how New Age orientations, they don't come out of nowhere, and as much as they're characterized by a certain sort of individualistic consumer approach, they have their own genealogies, they have their own histories, and the idea that various, especially exoteric religious practices or traditions across cultures and across time, the idea that they are ultimately expressions or fragments of an original sort of wisdom religion, a perennial philosophy that transcends their specific particulars, that idea is a traceable idea. It's traceable in particular to Theosophy, mid-19th century. And so, like, as a scholar, I'm also very interested in not just identifying or diagnosing a certain attitude towards practice that we see amongst sort of quote-unquote New Agey types, but also recognizing that too has a history, that too emerged from particular historical, political, intellectual conditions. And again, I think understanding those conditions makes us better equipped to see the value perhaps in some sort of neo-tantric practices or new age approaches, but then also to sort of rigorously distinguish and also appreciate where these often quite implicit assumptions are coming from that are guiding the behavior of sort of interested people who are trying to approach traditional indigenous spiritual systems, but may not even be aware of the kind of background assumptions or normative ideas that are guiding how they're approaching these things. So for me as a scholar, I think it's also important. Like, people often want to just critique New Age practices or misunderstandings, but they themselves deserve kind of like solid scholarly treatment, and I think everyone could be better for that too. It helps to clarify like what we're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. And from a pedagogical perspective, as a teacher, I have to be honest. Some students are more teachable than others. Some are harder to instruct, and that difference has largely to do with their previous faith commitments that they might not even realize were faith commitments. So it's actually people who have a lot of background in some form of New Age spirituality are often the hardest to teach. They don't want to sacrifice the ideas from that background that are incompatible with tantric practice, and yet they want to be a tantrika. Mm-hmm. And it's problematic. It presents quite a challenge. And having said that, though, I want to acknowledge that somebody who's coming from mainstream Hinduism into Tantra, even though originally that was the entry point, the people were coming from Hindu traditions into Tantra in India as the majority, since especially once Buddhism disappeared in the Indian subcontinent, and yet the modern Hinduism is a different thing from pre-modern Hinduism. And so people coming with a background in the Bhagavad Gita, for example, that or the kind of Hinduism based in the Bhagavad Gita, which is very, very, very heavy in terms like dharma and karma, terms which are almost irrelevant for many tantric lineages. They don't talk about dharma or swadharma or karma. Those were not central concepts for most of the non-dual tantric lineages anyway. So the person coming in from that perspective is going to need to be sort of reoriented and retrained as well. But so that's part of the challenge, is that people coming into or getting introduced to tantric practice, the ideal student would be one who's willing to just let go of everything they think they know, and empty their cup. That old famous Zen story about the student comes to the Zen master, says, "Will you teach me?" Says, "Yeah, but first let's have tea," and then pours the tea and then just keeps pouring as it overflows until the prospective student says, "Hey, what are you doing? You're crazy. You're just pouring more into a full cup." And the Zen master stops and says, "And that is what you want me to do with you. You're already full of all your knowledge and preconceptions. How is it that I can teach you? It'll be as useless as pouring tea into this full cup." And so I would say, if you want to really enter into an effective tantric sadhana, you've got to be willing to sacrifice, and that means both in the arena of sacrificing your self-images, your attachments, your egoic preconceptions, but also sacrificing whatever it is that you want to believe true and smuggle into your tantric practice without having it be challenged, because in a radical awakening process, everything has to be challenged. And so any attachment to any belief or belief system is gonna undermine that practice. So that's the number one thing I would want people to know who are approaching these traditions and want to approach them effectively.
Yeah, that's a great transition, because kind of in closing, I wanted to see if either of you had, advice for young aspiring practitioners who are really moved by what they read in the books that you've written or, edited and translated for, and, how to navigate this, because you yourselves have navigated this path of scholar practitioners, and you've kind of had to avoid all these pitfalls and face these problems and, face what comes up within yourself. Maybe I see a lot of young people really overflowing cups. The cups are very full and they're 20 years old and they think they know it all. And, we all kind of have been, once you've been around a while, you realize that actually, you've got to dump some things out and have that curiosity and that openness and be willing to change. And so do you have advice for people they've recognized this, they want to move forward, and how to navigate this path in a skillful way?
Yeah, I would say that, it is a path of practice. So the first thing to do is having, read the books or whatever, maybe, and you've got this idea, I might want to be a tantrika, and it's significant to note, by the way, that you don't just declare yourself a tantrika because you happen to like tantric philosophy. I am a tantrika is a phrase that refers to a dedicated spiritual practice that you've received, from a teacher or teachers, and that is connected to your relationship to a specific spiritual community, sometimes multiple communities, and specific teachers. So what it really boils down to, the practical advice is to sit with and practice with and listen to teachers within the tradition or iteration of Tantra that you're most interested in, and until you find a place that, where you're getting that click, right? The click of like, yes, this feels right. This is lighting me up, but it's also challenging me. And that's not just orienting to a specific teacher, but it's also looking at the community that surrounds that teacher, meaning to say, if people in the community are showing the fruits of spiritual practice, that's a good sign. If on average, the longer they've been practicing, the less emotionally reactive they are, or the less often they're out of center, or the less the more compassionate they are, the more present they are. You want to look for actual signs that this practice is working, and that's always going to be on average. You shouldn't judge any community based on any given individual or even a few individuals. You want to look on average. Does it seem to be working? Are people getting somewhere with this? So you need a community that you can connect with, and one or more teachers that you can connect with and trust. And so that takes time often. You've got to do some shopping around sometimes. But then once you've done your shopping around, everybody, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I've seen in real life, everybody needs a few years, and sometimes more than a few years, of dedicated practice within a single lineage, within a single community, to get somewhere that then they can open up to, sometimes other versions or iterations of the path. That's a very good thing to do once you've drilled down into one version, because then you can start to see how different practices are sometimes the same practice taught in different ways. Different teachings are sometimes the same teaching taught in different ways, within the context of Tantra anyway. So the model, if we kind of give it a visual image, I think of an hourglass shape. And the hourglass represents that if the time vector is vertical, right, it means you're starting out broad and you're sampling around and shopping. Again, not amongst all the world's religions, or you'll spend the rest of your life doing that, but within tantric lineages and tantric disciplines, you're shopping around different teachers, maybe even checking out Buddhist, checking out Shaiva, checking out Shakta, and then finding a place that you can feel you can drill down, and that's the narrowing of the hourglass, and spend 5 or 10 years really going deep with that tradition. And then you're going to need to open out again, not in the same way as you did before, but rather now I need to see how these same insights, realizations, and techniques are articulated differently in other lineages, so that that can mean going deep with one teacher and then opening out and experiencing other teachers who again are compatible, and you're not like looking to change paths or anything. You're looking to understand your own path more deeply through that diversity. So hopefully this makes sense. It's something that's hard to put into just a few words, but this hourglass model I've found can be a practical way of thinking about how to approach the path, and that narrow portion is something that a lot of people are averse to, but as far as I can tell, is indispensable. That you have some years where you're going deep in one version of the path.
Yeah, that sounds eminently sensible to me as well. One thing that I've noticed in myself and observing people around me is that I think sometimes there are some eager would-be or new students who want to expedite that initial stage of shopping around. And again, I think it relates to stuff we spoke about before. Somehow there's this idea that if one can't find a teacher, so there's a sense of urgency, something I can relate to because I was a precocious kid and I felt I had to understand the ultimate truths of reality as soon as possible. And as you mentioned, that changes as you get a bit older. But I also see a lot of people, they're very drawn to Vajrayana, and of course there's this promise of liberation in one complete Buddhahood or liberation in one human body in one human lifetime. So already there's sort of an expedited process. So it's interesting that people still rush, and I often get messages these days from people who are saying, there's no authentic lineage holding Tibetan lamas in my state of the US or in South Africa, and I don't have money to travel around. And, I feel like a good piece of advice in that case is to start with what you've got. There's often this urgency to receive as many transmissions as one can get, and that's also not particularly useful because, as Chris was saying, that knuckling down interim period is about knuckling down to specific practices even within your own specific lineage too. So I see a lot of kind of anxious urgency amongst practitioners, and then also sort of maybe spiritual indigestion as well. And I don't know, I mean, in the non-tantric Buddhist context, the expectation is that it will take eons of accruing wisdom and merit and good karma to get to a point where one can achieve complete Buddhahood. And of course Tantra is promising something slightly different, but again, the problem in a spiritual system that recognizes rebirth is not that we have too little time; it's that we have too much time running around senselessly. So rather slowly but surely set yourself in a direction without maybe being over anxious, because you also see this sort of other phenomenon of people feeling like they have to settle down with a particular group or a particular teaching because they're available, or they have to rush through preliminary practices, like in the Tibetan Buddhist case, they have to rush through Ngondro because it's a sort of gatekeeping exercise, so they think they have to complete a certain number of practices so that they can move on to the good stuff or the main practice, and that's just not the case. The whole reason you do those practices is because they embody the whole path, and you'll never stop doing them your whole life. So urgency can be good, if it's propelled by a feeling of renunciation from kind of worldly appearances and investments, but not if it's propelled by a kind of athletic, competitive, anxious sense of having to move forward in the spiritual process rather than just having to sit and settle down and focus in practice. So I feel like those things are different. And having recognized those impulses in myself, I thought I'd add that.
And I would say the other thing that just begs to be addressed, that's crucial to address, is the difference between sort of a gradualist view of the spiritual path and a more kind of sudden or immediate view, and how these are seen as different and how they need not be. So, for example, in the Neo-Advaita circles, the view of the path is anti-practice in a way. It's anti-yoga, right? It's that realization of the nature of reality, dawns in an instant, and you just keep trying to create the conditions in which that instantaneous realization can happen.
Isn't that yoga, though? Creating the conditions for that?
Well, exactly. This is what Abhinavagupta's point was, because, Abhinavagupta, the great tantric master, taught what could be called a krama-kramavada in Sanskrit, which means a sequential and non-sequential view of the path, meaning to say that there's a place for practices that have a gradual effect, that gradually deconstruct your conditioning or wear away your ego, or remove so-called impurities or kind of unresolved impressions of past experiences that constitute impediments to realizing your essence nature, which are themselves linked to self-images often. That wearing away some of that is a gradualist process, and yet at any given moment you can suddenly pierce through to some aspect of realization, right? Because it at least in the tantric conception of this, there's not just one realization. There's not, there's sort of stages of realization. There's aspects or facets of the one diamond, if you will, of realization, and that at any moment you could pierce through to and clearly see one of these facets of realization, and that therefore the path is both gradual and sudden, and that it's actually a dangerous dichotomy to imagine it's either just thoroughly gradualist and liberation or full awakeness is something that
it's over there at the very end.
It's way over
Takes
there
eons.
once I've done all the practices a million times or whatever it is. But it's also just as dangerous, these Neo-Advaitins who poo-poo or they denigrate practice, spiritual practice, as useless. And I think both of these are wrong view in very, very practical ways, and that so it's worthwhile for I think all tantrikas of all lineages to consider Abhinavagupta's argument, which I'm working on translating in full, where he lays out the path in these multiple dimensions and shows you how it can be krama, both gradual and sequential, and sudden and immediate, both, and that those shouldn't be it shouldn't be one or the other.
Right, it shouldn't be opposed. It makes me think of Dzogchen language as well in the Tibetan context, about the recognition of the nature of mind and nature of reality, and then the different ways of translating, but the sort of sustaining or maintaining or nurturing of that, and how that very much is a kind of like integrating of subitist, if you want to use a technical language, sudden approach and then gradualist approach, because sure we can recognize, but then what, how do we nurture, how do we sustain, how do we maintain, how do we integrate those realizations, those piercing through moments.
So in other words, doing the spiritual practices, doing any or all yogic practices, both create a context in which sudden realization is possible, but they also create contexts in which the integration of those realizations are possible. So we don't want to One of my Tantra teachers simply said, all extreme views are false views, which I think is great. And to say the path is gradualist is an extreme view. To say it's sudden is an extreme view, you know. And so, and of course, this is not as simple as all that, because when we talk about the middle path, and people's conceptualization of what that means is often at odds with traditional views, but that's the subject for maybe another podcast.
Yeah, so much has been brought up in this conversation that could be great subjects for further interview podcast conversations. So I guess in closing, since we're kind of at about an hour and a half, it's a pretty long talk for people to listen to. I guess I just want to ask each of you, if someone wanted to learn more about your research, more about what you're doing and what you're contributing for practitioners or budding scholar practitioners, where should they go to follow some of your work?
For me, I would say, well, I have these two books out, of course, Tantra Illuminated and the Recognition Sutras, which are really great orientations. Like if I had my way, I would prefer to only teach people who have read the books, because then we can save lots of time. We can go deeper. That's kind of the reason a teacher writes books, is so that then it's like, okay, you can absorb that, and then we can come together and go deeper together, in person and as a community and online, right? So, you know, and having read those books, then I've got this, you know, Facebook group, which is very, very, very active, Tantric Yoga Now, and then my website, tantricstudies.org or harish.org, same website, just two different.
That's tantric with a K in all instances.
Tantric, right? With a K is how I always spell it, to distinguish it from the spelling used in the modern Western idea of tantric sex, which we didn't even get to talk about, but maybe another time.
It's a whole other thing.
But tantric with a K, yeah, tantric yoga, and tantric studies. And I also want to recommend Ben's book, or the book he co-authored with Dr. Nita, which he'll mention here himself. But I've been so delighted to get to know Ben, because he's such an important new voice in Tantric Buddhist studies. And how can people find out more about your work?
Right, well, I should say, just in case it hasn't been clear, I'm emphatically not a teacher of Tibetan Buddhism. I'm qualified to teach anthropology. But yeah, I have my own personal research blog, which hasn't been updated in quite some time, because I'm focusing now on actually finally finishing my doctoral dissertation. But yeah, the book has been mentioned, and so I was an editor and translator for a book with my own lama or teacher and sort of primary research collaborator, Dr. Nida Chenatsang. Nida is a Tibetan traditional doctor, was born and raised in Tibet and now lives in Europe and travels around the world to teach Tibetan traditional medicine, but he is also a lineage holding Ngakpa, a tantric yogi, a non-celibate, non-monastic tantric yogi. So because this is my area of scholarship, we have been working together for the last few years to publish translations and commentaries, typically translations of his Tibetan writing on Tibetan traditional medicine and tantric yoga traditions with which he's familiar. So the book that you mentioned is an introductory kind of text for general English readers to try to create some kind of context for the role and the place of sexual yoga practice in Vajrayana, because this is a highly misunderstood topic, and how this could relate to the lives of contemporary practitioners, if at all. My personal research blog is A Perfumed Skull, so listeners can find it at www.perfumedskull.com, and I usually have translations up there, working translations, or just musings, anthropological thoughts on all sorts of things. I also chime in occasionally in the Tantric Yoga Now group, so a great and active community of practitioners and also very informed scholarly trained people too, so it's a wonderful platform.
And just to emphasize one thing about Ben's work, so he clarified he's not a spiritual teacher, and but what I've heard from practitioners that they love about his work is a lot of people interested in Tantra have also been exposed to Neo-Tantra, or sacred sexuality, as a kind of subset of the New Age scene, or whether it self-identifies as that or not. And the interesting thing about this book, Karma Mudra, which Ben collaborated on, is that many people who have experienced Neo-Tantra, or tantric sex, quote unquote, who want to find out, well, wait a second, what's the actual traditional role of sexual practices in traditional Tantra? How is traditional Tantra and its sexual practices different from Neo-Tantra? One of the best places they can go to learn about that is this book, Karma Mudra. So I've had kind of neo-tantric students of mine say, "Oh my gosh, this corresponds more to some things I learned in neo-tantra than anything else, but is also different," and it's a powerful source for educating people about that. Well, so read our books.
Well, thank you, both of you, for participating in this very enlightening conversation, and I hope that we can have future dialogues on various other topics.
For sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Katherine.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Remember, you can always find out more about the tradition of non-dual Shaiva Tantra at tantrailluminated.org, where, if you wish, you can become a subscriber to our online learning portal, and you'll receive access to a vast number of recordings, including a comprehensive curriculum in tantric philosophy, tantric yoga, guided meditation, and much, much more. Music for the podcast composed and recorded by Ann Leader. Find her at annleader.com. Podcast produced by Grazia Tribulato. New episodes drop every week, and may all beings benefit.